Morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day in our LASLAB conference. Today, I have the honor and the privilege to introduce the plenary speakers of this morning session. So, Isabelle UDRY is a researcher and lecturer at the Institute of Multilingualism at the University of Freiburg and the Turk University of Teacher Education. She's interested in cognitive processes that underlie multilingualism and foreign language learning and how they can contribute to the development of teaching methodology. Her research focuses on individual differences in language learning, creativity, and multilingualism, language aptitude, and the role of digital technology in the foreign language classroom. Then BERTHELÉ is professor in multilingualism at the University of Freiburg. He studied and worked at the Universities of Freiburg, Tübingen, Berkeley, and Bern. He co-founded the Freiburg Institute of Multilingualism in 2008. Currently, he directs the MA programs in multilingualism studies and in foreign language pedagogy. His research interests cover different areas from cognitive to social aspects of multilingualism. Over the last years, he has focused on the empirical investigation of receptive multilingualism, on the acquisition of literacy skills in multilinguals, on spatial reference and bi and multilinguals, and on individual differences in language learning. So it is my honor to have you as speakers, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you, Pilar, for inviting us. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you some insights from our project on individual differences in instructed foreign language learning at primary school.
All right, there's a handout. You will see the QR code again at the end. You don't need the handout to follow the talk, but it's just our slides are so full of stuff that you might want to download them if you're interested in it. So there's an impressive number of language experts out there who have developed their own approaches and ideas about the best way of becoming a polyglot or super polyglot. One of them is a guy, I don't know, his name is Chris Lonsdale. There's a TEDx talk out there about anyone can learn a language to fluency in 6 months. And so anyone, regardless of, cognitive or whatever skills or abilities or background. And on the other hand, so that's one type of discourse, and we're actually very familiar with this type of discourse in the language teaching world. There is certainly in our context, there's a strong belief in teacher education and language teaching in general, that anybody is actually gifted for languages. If it doesn't work, it's the teacher's fault or it's the learner's fault, but it's theoretically anybody is equally gifted to learn languages. This, of course, stands in a very strong contrast to what aptitude research shows us, and in particular, the more modern variant of aptitude research, also looking at brain anatomy, for instance, where people find actually quite substantial differences, sometimes also innate differences that make us more or less apt, for instance, to detect phonological contrasts. Basically what we're going to talk about is a research project we've been busy with over the last few years, where we ask the simple question, what are the predispositions that make language learning easier or more tedious for individuals? And there's a lot of research on young adults and adults, but not so much about children. And in this project that we're going to present here, we were working on children. The project is basically finished. We've written a book, which is open access in Langside Press. And also the data and the scripts are published, so you can download everything and do better analysis than what we did. But today we're going to present a little bit of what is published, but we're also going to present 2 new analyses. Well, one of them is also published, but in German. Nobody reads German, so we're going to present it here. And the other one is about to be published, and this is the part that Isabelle will present. So just to give you a very, very brief historical introduction in language aptitude research, because I think it is important in our field. Sometimes people tend to forget that there is actually a history of things, and people think that, oh, we have this new language pedagogy and it's all amazing, and very often you discover actually these questions have been out there for quite some time. So language aptitude research is actually an old thing. In the first half of the 20th century, especially in the US, there was actually already quite a whole current of development of language aptitude testing in the wake of the emerging intelligence research. And in particular, when high school education became generalized in the US, almost everybody had to learn a foreign language. And, but at the same time, people realized that the achievement was also the failure rate was very high. People didn't learn much. So people started being interested in how can we prognosticate foreign language learning. And there were actually quite interesting first attempts. For instance, a Sister Virgil, Mary in Michigan, deplored the mortality in foreign language classes and devised herself a quite interesting test battery for her German as a foreign language classes. So there's an interesting paper by Spolsky out there that actually, tells you some interesting details about the history of language aptitude research. So overall, these early attempts to test language aptitude were of low prognostic value. It didn't work very well to predict how well learners will perform. The problem got even more important in the context of the World Wars, especially Second World War, where American intelligence and military needed people who could rapidly learn the languages of the enemy. Yeah. And so there was a linguistic training school in Monterey in California that taught Russian, Hungarian, and all kinds of other languages. And the failure rates were extremely high, so 80% for Japanese, for instance. So there was a call for a systematic approach to predict who is going to do well and who is not going to do well, because you wanted to invest time and money only in individuals who were actually promising in terms of language learning. And that's where Carol and Sapon, names that you've certainly heard, come in, and they developed in their institute in Harvard. They tested the Air Force officers and did basically a whole test battery, and then looked at the development of the foreign language development of these learners in language classes, and identified the main components based on factor analytical procedures that allow to predict success or failure in foreign language learning. And that's what led to the very, very influential MLOT test that is actually still being used. And it's actually quite hard to get hold of it, because it's still used also by the military and by the intelligence services. The theory, Carol and Sapon's theory, comprises 4 different components: phonetic coding, grammatical sensitivity, rote learning, and inductive learning ability. But it is important to notice that the last one, inductive learning ability, that I actually find particularly interesting, is not really implemented in the MLOT test. But it was implemented in later tests, and we've already heard some talks that also addressed these different possibilities of testing aptitude. So to give you an example or a list of the test modules of the MLOT, you can see here number learning, that would be the rote learning component, then phonetic script, spelling clues, words and sentences, and paired associate learning. So this test has been extremely successful, and it was the basis for instance, the LAMA test. And Karen has already talked about a lot of these things, so I think I can be relatively brief here. Let me just give you some examples so that you have maybe a more concrete idea if you've never seen those tests. An example for the words and sentences test. We did an adaptation of the MLOT elementary for the young learners, and we tested pupils in the German-speaking Swiss context, so we had to translate it. There was no translation, and we adapted it to our primary school participants. And basically, you have to figure out the syntactic role of words that are printed in uppercase but there's no grammatical meta-language. It's just really about, analyzing a language that you master well, okay? Your native language, but in the case of the Swiss Germans, it's debatable whether this is actually their native language, because they're all dialect speakers. Anyway, there's other types of tests, in particular the Pimsleur test, the PLAB test, that then also have a component that measures this inferencing skill that I mentioned before. And we also did an adaptation of one of the modules of that test, which you can see here, and without going into details, you have to figure out the morphosyntax of a completely unknown language. You get some clues, and basically then you just need to somehow learn the rules that underlie these mappings of translations to the new forms that you see here. And basically what you then do is just there's a given number of minutes, I don't remember how much, half an hour or something, yeah. And then you just count the number of correctly solved items. Aptitude testing then was less fashionable in the context of what we've already discussed yesterday a little bit, in the context of these ideas about natural implicit learning. For instance, Krashen has been very clear that for him language aptitude testing is only relevant for learning and not for acquisition. And so actually people thought that aptitude is irrelevant if you teach languages properly, which is of course the natural approach. But the problem is those who continued testing language aptitude and, and associated these test scores with achievement or gain scores, they actually found exactly the same linear association also with natural approach learners. So actually, let's be honest, language pedagogy changes a lot and sometimes rapidly, but these things actually stay quite often more or less the same. So these linear associations stay largely the same, and that's why even old-fashioned tests, and sometimes difficult actually to publish something that uses the MLOT, because reviewers think, oh, this is very old-fashioned, don't use MLOT anymore. But actually their prognostic value seems to be still absolutely okay. So what counts as, or what factors or what components contribute to aptitude? There are, even in the very, very early discussions of aptitude, people also included things like anxiety, motivational constructs. So it's not just things like intelligence or working memory or other cognitive factors. We've already heard a lot about this yesterday. But also, yeah, as I said, anxiety, motivation, for instance, teacher encouragement, parental encouragement, things like that. And of course, today we know that there's also, to some extent, some of these components have a genetic component. I'm not saying everything is genetics, but there is some variability that can be explained by genetics, which is a very uncomfortable thing to say, especially in social science contexts. But we just have to acknowledge that this is also a factor that has an influence. And of course, in the multilingualism context, what is often foregrounded is the idea that it's actually language experience, and Karen has talked about this yesterday, is that language experience makes you an apt learner. So if you grow up bilingually, you're going to be a more apt learner than if you grow up, if you unfortunately grow up only with one language. That's the dominant view of things. So the mainstream view is that, as I'm quoting here, two relatively recent books about multilingualism, where you almost uniformly read in this literature that if you already master several languages, adding a third language is going to be easier. I have to say that it is interesting that this literature always completely blinds out. Actually, there's a massive research that doesn't show these positive effects, or shows even negative effects, and also in our data, we don't always find this boosting effect, especially not if you control for cognitive and other variables, which I will show you today. So I actually agree with Julia Festmann's position. She says there is no straightforward answer to the question of whether successive language learning does indeed get progressively easier just because you become a better learner. Because the problem is really, how do you identify causality here? Are people becoming multilinguals because they're apt, or are they apt because they are multilinguals? And just, it's very difficult to actually pinpoint the causality here. But in the literature, it seems to be completely clear, which I always find very surprising. So the project we're going to talk about was funded by the Swiss National Center of Competence on Multilingualism, and it is, okay, so we have the privilege to talk about it here, but it was a whole group of people who worked on it, and we construed aptitude in a broad sense, so including motivation, anxiety, and social background, also as a form of predisposition to language learning. I will talk about social background a little bit at the very end if there's time. The first sample is a sample from the canton of Freiburg. It's a smaller sample, 179 learners. They're all German speakers or have German as one of the important languages in their repertoire. They learn first French as a foreign language and then two years later English. The second sample, we will introduce it a little bit later. We don't want to give you too much information at the time. So here you can see an overview of the test battery. Of course, we're not going to go through this because we would spend an hour explaining you all these tests. Just to show you, we have language-related, like MLOT-style tests. We have cognitive, psychometric tests. We have more emotional things like locus of control, motivational, self-concept questionnaire items, and of course we have background variables. And we have two samples. LAPS 1 is the one in Freiburg, I just mentioned, and the second one is more or less the same. We did some adaptations because not all tests were as good as we thought they were going to be, so we did some adaptations, but they are minor. Okay, so this is Freiburg. I mean, this is the canton of Freiburg is here. It is mostly French-speaking, but it's a bilingual canton, and we tested only in the German-speaking minority area. And the second sample is from the Zurich area, which is in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So what did we do? The first thing is, with all these data, we tried to reduce the number of dimensions. So what you typically do is a factor analysis. And this worked well with our first sample in Freiburg. We found basically three components or three factors. Foreign language learning aptitude, all these aptitude tests, MLOT-inspired, PLAB-inspired, LAMA tests, but also field independence, working memory, and all on IQ. So everything cognitive, basically, was mapped on that dimension. The second one type of motivation, extrinsic, so encouragement, parental encouragement, or I want to learn French because I want to work in a Francophone context, motivational constructs like that. And intrinsic motivation, of course, negatively associated with anxiety and self-concept, so I'm a good learner of French. Okay, so these three factors, and of course, factor analysis is a tricky thing. You may find a very neat factor structure in one sample, you test another sample and the structure is completely different. Or you take out one or two data points and the whole thing shifts completely. It's relatively unstable. So we did a confirmatory factor analysis with the second sample, for which, as you can see here, we have three measurement points. But we're not going to talk a lot. Well, Isabelle is going to talk about the longitudinal aspect a little bit, but here I just talk about T1. And as you can see, the sample is bigger here. So we have fourth graders, 289 fourth graders, and 326 fifth graders at T1. And so what we did, we fitted this factor structure that we found in the first sample for French as a foreign language for the Zurich children whose foreign language that we tested was English. Their first foreign language is English. So it's a different foreign language, but we have more or less the same test. So we fitted the same model, but in this as a confirmatory model. And it is a good fit, so which encourages to think that there's something true in what we found, because these are completely independent samples, different curricula, different target languages, but the structure seems to be a good fit. So what does this mean? These three factors I just mentioned, the cognitive factor here, and the L2 academic, this emotional factor, intrinsic motivation, self-concept, they are strongly associated with achievement in the foreign language. This is a descriptive plot for English as a foreign language, but it's the same for French as a foreign language. Whereas the extrinsic, the two regression lines are the two different grade levels. The extrinsic motivation seems to be less associated with learning outcome, if you want, in the foreign language, because as long as you control for the two other factors. So this is multiple regression, so it's always taking into account the two other factors. This variable doesn't seem to be very strongly associated with learning. Okay, so to sum up this first part, we didn't find, and that was really interesting, and it's actually quite challenging presenting this to an audience of generativists, because we didn't find anything specifically linguistic in our data, which we were open to, whatever factor structure emerges. So the linguistic tests and the general cognitive tests are very strongly associated. There's no empirical grounds to distinguish between them. That's the first finding. We find two types of motivational constructs, a more intrinsic one and a more extrinsic one, and Isabelle will give you much more detail about this in a minute. We did find positive associations of this first cognitive and this third intrinsic emotional factor associated with language learning, but not with of extrinsic motivation. So that was my first bit, and I think I did well. Yes. Now, Isabelle, it's your turn.
Thank you, Raphael. Okay, now you have a good overview of the whole project, and we'd like to zoom in now into some specific areas that we explored in more detail. And I would like to start with special education, and to give you a bit more context of our situation when Switzerland introduced a second foreign language to primary school curricula about a decade ago. There were major concerns for these vulnerable students and how they would cope with not having to learn one but two foreign languages as early as primary school. And this was debated very emotionally, also in public. And unfortunately, there was a lack of data for our context, for the Swiss context, that could probably have contributed to the discussion. So we decided to look more into that. And I think we are all aware that mainstream primary school, they cater for a broad range of abilities, including the children with special needs. And the way special education is organized in Switzerland, it basically resides on the premise that any child whose needs cannot be met in the regular classroom is entitled to some sort of additional support. And so this covers a broad spectrum from disability to giftedness, and it also includes children whose first language is different from the language of instruction. And this can be seen maybe a little bit controversial, but within the logic of the system, this just means that these children will have access to more lessons in the language of instruction. So, and this framework is implemented by school based on, policies of their local government that sometimes changes from canton to canton. This is sort of the nice Swiss tradition. Everybody does a little bit, what they feel, the way it suits them. But basically, special education is delivered by trained staff who work in close collaboration with the regular classroom teachers. So wherever possible, inclusive and integrative settings are preferred. So this is how we work within the special education, framework. And from that, there are basically 4 categories of special needs that can be derived. The first one is integration and inclusion, and that just means that children are supported by a special needs teacher in the regular classroom in different areas, also maybe several subjects depending on the needs. Then there is a speech therapy for children who have maybe a developmental impairment in language development. The third category would be the German as an L2 classes for, as I said, children who do not speak the language of instruction at home. And then there is also a group of children who have been identified as being gifted. So this all falls under special education. And for the purpose of this study, we derived a 5th category, which we termed multiple support. And what that means is you have a few children who will receive multiple measures, a combination of the groups 1 to 4, and this usually stands for a more pronounced or a more complex learner situation, and we thought this was worth making visible in the data. And what this looks like, so we used the data from the LAPS 2 study with a bit more over 450 children. And what you can see here is that about a quarter of these children received some form of special education, which is a bit higher than the national average. And so they were grouped into these different categories, as I mentioned. And what we were interested in was, well, what are the English proficiency, what are the English skills like at the beginning of the study at T1, and how do these English skills develop over the course of one academic year from T1 to T2, as I will call it. And also, is the intensity of the special education that children receive actually predictive of that development? So this is what we looked at, and this is what we found. So you can see here violin plot of the different categories, including those children who have no support on the left. The red line is the sample mean, and the green lines indicate 1 or 2 standard deviations from the sample mean above or below. And what you notice is that the special needs categories, children in therapy with integration or with multiple support, they actually score as a group below the sample mean. And I think that's probably what you would expect intuitively. We also see that gifted children, or the group, the L2 German group, they actually score above the sample mean, which is interesting. What you also notice is that there is considerable overlap in the data. So you will have children with special education that will score well within the range of children with no support or above the sample mean. And at the same time, you will have children that have not been identified as having any particular learning difficulty. They are in the so-called no support group, but they will score in the same range as children who receive special education. And why do I point this out? I think you would get this, you would find this in any data. This is not something particular to have overlap between groups. That's why we express things in central tendencies. But here, because we are dealing with children and because these things have implications for their education, for their future, I think it's worth pointing this out. So there is overlap between groups. In terms of the development, as you can see here, the lines connecting T1 and T2, they go up for all categories. So we can say that as groups, all children actually learn something within one academic year, and you would kind of expect that, right? So, but I think this is good news. What we also see is that the order of the categories is maintained, which means that, for instance, children in speech therapy, they will not have experienced maybe like a boost due to the support they receive, a boost that would have maybe made them catch up with the no support group. We do not see any of these tendencies. So this is at the group level, but because of what I mentioned, because of this overlap between categories and because of the fact that this really covers a broad spectrum, we have gifted children, we have children who would be classified as disabled. It's not a lot of them, but the range of abilities really is very broad. We thought it would be insightful to have a look at whether the intensity of the special needs support is actually predictive of the development. And to this aim, we coded an ordinal variable, which we turned level of support. And so we assigned points to each measure based on 3 criteria: the expected risk of failure that was associated with the measure, the time invested in the measure, and also we made this distinction between teaching, which is usually done in groups and which is less intense, compared to maybe speech therapy, which usually happens in a one-to-one setting and is therefore more intense. So we looked at these criteria and we assigned points, which we then added based on each child's special needs profile. And that resulted in this level of support factor. And a high number means that there is a lot of support. Low number means not so much support. And we used this level of support to, we introduced it to a mixed effects model as a predictor, and we used the gain score, the English gain score, as the dependent variable. And we also introduced class as a random effect, because, to account for the clustered nature of the sample. And as you can see from the graph, high level of support means less gains in English skills, and this actually was an effect that reached statistical significance. So to sum this up, in a nutshell, we could find that more intense special educational measures means also less progress in English skills. We found that children who receive multiple support, who are in different categories of this, what the system offers, they are among the most vulnerable learners. But we also noticed this overlap between the categories. So this implies that not all children who receive special education will also have trouble with learning a foreign language, and vice versa. And I think this is worth pointing out because belonging to a special needs category does not really provide reliable criteria if it comes down to making educational decisions, right? For instance, when you decide whether a child should be maybe exempted from foreign language learning classes. And I think this is really something worth keeping in mind. Positive insight was that all categories actually progress between T1 and T2. So I think this implies that there is no really strong or ongoing experience of cognitive overload in these children, which was actually what was feared in this discussion that I mentioned in the beginning. So this is what I can tell you about special education. Maybe we can come back to it in the discussion round. Our data, as you pointed out, Raphael, showed that effective motivational dispositions are meaningfully associated with foreign language learning. So this confirmed or added to a body of research that is already there. And so we're interested in looking more deeply into these, I think what you would call more malleable characteristics of the learner. Academic self-concepts, which is a student's self-perceived level of skill in any academic domain. There is quite a large body of research that documents consistently positive correlations with a range of desirable learning outcomes. To give a bit more insight of what academic self-concept are conceptualized, like they are thought to be multidimensional and hierarchical, and you can see here the model by Marsh and Shavelson. There are other models, but this is one that is still quite frequently referred to in the literature, and you can see here that they make a basic distinction between verbal self-concept and math concept as sort of overarching, and then there are domain-specific self-concepts, let's say in the verbal domain, for instance, for the language of instruction, then for foreign languages, for history, for all these subjects that are more tied to the use of language, and the same for maths. You would have a self-concept for math, for physics, chemistry, etc. Academic self-concepts are thought to, develop gradually over time based on self-evaluations from internal and external sources of references. And that's what we found was interested to look at how different variables that we assessed in the questionnaire actually turned out in the structure of children's self-concepts. Because again, there is a lot of research done with adults and adolescents, but not so much with children, especially in the domain of foreign language learning. So that was interesting. And Sarah Mercer has done a lot of work into L2 self-concepts with the case studies with adults. And just to give you some examples of what is an internal source of reference, usually these are self-perceptions of individual performance in different target languages or belief systems that we have about language learning or the target languages. And also actually motivation and effect come into play here. External sources of reference are mainly social comparisons with feedback from what we would call significant others, whether these are parents, peers, or teachers, and this ties in with foreign language experience. And I think the two, there's always also there an overlap, and they are connected. There's not a lot of research on foreign language self-concepts in children. So we were interested in untangling the patterns of association between internal and external variables. So the questionnaire that we administered consisted of a total of 42 items for these different areas. And as we mentioned, the curriculum of foreign language learning in Switzerland, it's a bit of a patchwork because every district kind of does its own thing, which is a challenge, but for us it meant that we ended up with quite a unique sample of different language curricula, with one group starting with a national language, followed by English, the LAPS 1 group, and the LAPS 2 group was the other way around. So it was quite interesting to see whether the patterns of association would hold between these groups, and whether children at primary school, 11 and 12-year-olds, had already developed distinct self-concepts, maybe for L2 and L3. We used network analysis to approach this question, and network analysis is basically a visualization of partial correlations, right? It's been used recently a lot in psychology, and it's also been put forward as a promising approach to assessing or exploring processes of second language acquisition and foreign language learning. And basically what you can see here is the variables are represented as nodes or circles, and the correlations among these variables are represented as lines. Blue lines stand for positive correlations and red lines for negative correlations. The strength of the correlation is represented as the thickness of the line. Okay? What you can see as well is the distance between the different nodes. This stands for the strength of the correlation, and that actually allows you to detect clusters in your data. Now let me talk you through this a bit more, right? This is the network structure of the self-concepts of children that started with English, followed by French. And what you can see here, the red circles are the self-concepts, English on the left, French on the right, and you can see they are very distinct. They are hardly connected at all, so we assume that children have already developed separate self-concepts for these areas of study. The green circles stand for English, the blue ones are French, and there as well you can see they are quite separate. If I would put like a line between the green and the blue circles, you could almost have like a mirror image, right? So this means that in the two languages, the associations or the patterns are quite similar. And we found that internal variables, intrinsic motivation and anxiety, were most strongly connected with the self-concepts, as well as dedication as a more external variables. And that was the same thing in both languages. And dedication seemed to play like a key role in the system. It sort of connects with different variables and sort of acts as a mediator between external and internal variables. As far as teacher encouragement or perceived teacher encouragement is concerned, this also seems part of this cluster around self-concept, but it's a lot less correlated. The correlation is a lot weaker here. In terms of external variables, which is the extrinsic motivation for school, including comparison with peers, but also encouragement from parents, these are sort of the outsiders in the system. They are not really strongly connected with academic self-concepts, and so they seem to play less of a role in the formation of foreign language self-concepts. So overall, we found similar patterns of self-concepts in both groups and target languages, regardless of the introduction to these target languages. We could say that there are distinct self-concepts and that there are stronger correlations with internal variables, intrinsic motivation and anxiety, compared to extrinsic variables, which is parental encouragement, extrinsic motivation for school, or also teacher encouragement. Dedication seemed to play an important role, as I said, because it seems to mediate the associations between external and internal variables and children's self-concepts for foreign language learning. Right, moving on.
All right, yeah.
How do we
So
go?
in the last, yeah, we're doing well for time. Certainly for time, we're doing well. Yes, in the last 10 minutes, what Isabelle has presented is like zooming in on two specific questions. And in these last 10 minutes, I would like to zoom out again and have another look at the greater picture of aptitude. And this time, including here an important aspect that was somehow already present in this these external variables. Of course, they are related to social background, because if you feel encouraged to learn foreign languages in general, or specifically English or French, that may make a difference. And we know from educational sociology that there's such a thing as expectancy effects. From teachers, but also from parents or from peers, and so they're robust. They're not very strong, but they're robust. And so, in this last few minutes, I would like to focus on the background, social, cultural, economic background of the kids in our larger sample. Because this is also from a sociological perspective probably relevant, because as Isabelle mentioned, there was, when the curriculum changes were done, one of the worries, especially from people from special education, but also from educational sociologists, was that precisely vulnerable group, and this in our systems usually means immigrants who speak other languages, but it's not the expats. It's more like socially lower strata that immigrate, that are considered a problem for the system. So we looked at social variables specifically. There's a whole chapter in our book about this. And if you look at it just with a bivariate perspective, which you must not do, that's why I'm going to do it now, then you see that, for instance, the family's monthly income, it doesn't matter the exact figures, but you just see the more, further to the right of a child, the more money, okay? And this is English skills at T1, and what you can see is a very clear, unsurprising association of income with English skill. Of course, what is the causality? There's a lot of theories out there why this is the case. But this is it's not just for English skills, which we tested with the Oxford Young Learners test at T1. But it is also, I showed you our adaptation of the MLOT module on grammatical sensitivity, which is in the right panel, is exactly the same. So it's not just English, it's basically all kinds of abilities and skills. If we look at another variable, background variable, whether the kids speak German as a family language or not, actually, in contrast to what I described as the mainstream in multilingualism research, if the kid speaks other languages than German at home, the English skills are actually lower. And if the kid is born in Switzerland or not, if the child is not born in Switzerland, again, the skills are lower. This is, to sociologists, this is totally unsurprising, but it goes against the multilingualism boost theory. So, but of course, as I said, we must not look at data in such a bivariate way, because we have all this information about the kids. We have all these tests and all these context information. And that's what I'm going to do in this last analysis. So we have tested English with the Oxford Young Learners test, and we have these three constructs that emerge from the factor analysis. Two of which were clearly associated in the expected direction with English skills. So I'm only going to include these two constructs. So we got rid of the extrinsic construct just because we know it's not that important, okay? So academic emotion, this intrinsic, more intrinsic component, and all these tests, MLOT, PLAB, IQ. And we decided to do two different constructs. Yeah, I don't know. to create two different constructs, one which we could associate with, Bourdieu's idea of economic capital, and the other one with the idea of more of cultural capital being education, how many books, and economic capital, money. Can the bills be paid? Can they go on holidays? Do they own their house? How many rooms do they have? That kind of question. And everything then was put everything in a structural equation model. So this is not exactly the same as network analysis, because network analysis doesn't presuppose any constructs and only looks at partial correlations. And this is a structural equation model. So you have the assumption that you have manifest variables that are related, that are the construct, that are metrics of the construct, and you look at regressions and correlations between the constructs. That's what you're mainly interested in. So I know this is difficult to read. Let me talk you through this. So we have our two types of capital, economic and cultural capital. We have academic emotion, our intrinsic variable, and we have the cognitive factor. And what we're interested in is how are these things related among the four constructs, but also how are these things related to English, because we're interested in how kids learning foreign languages. So in this graph, basically, if you can't see a line, it means it's not important. No. So what you can see immediately here is that there's no direct path going from the two background variables to English. However, there are obviously paths going from the economic and the cultural context to, for instance, to cognition, and to some extent also to the academic emotion construct. So to sum up, what we can extract somehow from this structural equation is that we have a strong association between cognition and cultural predispositions. So whether the parents are, educated, more educated or less educated, for instance, that is very strongly associated, relatively strongly associated, we have to be a bit cautious, with this cognitive factor. We have a somewhat weaker association of the economic predispositions with this factor, but it's there, but it's weaker. We have an even weaker association of the background constructs and the academic emotion construct, which was surprising to me because, again, in our field, especially in intercultural education, there's this idea of habitus, and of monolingual habitus and multilingual habitus. And so that basically multilingual kids don't perform well in our Western educational systems because they come with the wrong habitus. They're not more stupid, but they have the wrong habitus, and they don't fit in well, and that's why they don't succeed. That's a very people are very convinced of this idea, and actually our data only weakly support this theory, because you would expect a much stronger correlation between these background variables on the one hand and these emotional predispositions to learning. And this is relatively weak. It's much stronger between background and cognition. Okay? Yeah. And so if we control for those associations that I just described, then actually there's only a very, very weak direct path going from these background variables to English proficiency. Now, two last questions, because we're approaching the end. Does it matter? I showed you the bivariate association. Does it matter whether the children speak German at home as one of their home languages or not? So is it a problem, or is it even an advantage if we control now for everything is the language spoken at home? And also the other variable that is often taken by educational sociologists is foreigner versus Swiss, born abroad, born in Switzerland. And so I basically just zoom on these specific variables that operationalize this binary category, German at home as one of the languages, yes or no. What you can see here, I don't know whether you can read it, but the standardized estimate is almost zero. So if we pick out that specific variable, controlling for everything else doesn't explain any variability. It means it's irrelevant whether they speak German at home or not. And even more zero for being born in Switzerland or abroad. This is the estimate here is basically zero. So it doesn't matter if you control for everything else, which I think is important for educational discussions. So, to sum up our findings, as I've said at the very beginning, pedagogy changes a lot, and in Switzerland, the teaching of foreign languages has undergone massive changes, with now a communicative / multilingual teaching paradigm being implemented in most places. But these associations, I mean, it's not, we have these new fancy teaching methods, but actually the associations with boring old MLOT type tests are still there. Now, we found an important impact of these cognitive abilities like IQ, working memory, and they are not separable from the specific linguistic tests in our data. Special education, I don't know, Isabelle, do you want to sum up?
Yeah, coming back to that, we saw that all children, including those with special education, progress over time. Oh, thank you. That high intensity of special education comes with lower English skills, but there is also considerable overlap in the abilities across the categories. In terms of motivation, we found two components along the lines of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, of which the intrinsic component was more strongly associated with skills than the extrinsic one. And what we didn't discuss, but what we also found is that the motivation for French as a national language was consistently lower than for English. For the self-concepts, we have similar patterns for the L2 and the L3. Consistent associations with internal variables, the anxiety and intrinsic motivation. And there are distinct language-oriented self-concepts for French and English in both groups that we looked at. And there are weak associations with extrinsic variables, which is, also we could see from the factor analysis.
Yes, and social background is what I just presented. We find, again, background is associated very strongly with the cognitive construct and weaker with the self-concept, which was to some extent surprising for us. The L1 is irrelevant if you control for everything else, and of course that's the problem. All these educational social justice discussions have to take into account that that immigration is confounded with social status and with basically economic predispositions. So very often we think that immigration or being a non-native speaker of the local language is a problem, when actually certainly what our data suggests, but also if you talk to sociologists, that's what they would confirm, is that it's very often social differences and not so much linguistic differences. So if we're, as applied linguists or language pedagogy people, we're often in the situation where we have to de-emphasize the role of language, in the sense that it's not just everything can be explained via the linguistic repertoire, positively or negatively. And so, I think that those were more or less our points. Thank you very much. If you're interested, you can download the handout. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now time for questions, comments.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation. I'm interested in SES and grammatical sensitivity. So that was MLAT or the score you, okay.
Yes.
So why are they related? I feel if the income is related or predictable of grammatical sensitivity, that goes against the whole idea of cognitive individual differences. So.
Okay, so this is a very tricky thing. I'm not sure whether we want to open this can of worms. So, but I know that what I'm going to say now is very controversial, and Isabelle might actually also disagree with me. I don't know. So we do know. I don't know whether you're familiar with the genetics literature, no. Blomin, blueprints, this kind of thing. So. I come from sociolinguistics originally, so I'm very, very familiar with the idea that it's basically social background will determine your educational success, and it's all the social construction, and its injustice is basically a product of social processes. Now, the geneticists, and this is based on like massive samples of basically twin studies and adoption studies, they have determined the contribution of both, and this is something people tend to forget, of both the shared social environment, the non-shared social environment on the one hand, so social environment, but it's shared and not shared, and the genetic contribution, because in twin studies, like, you can actually tease these things apart. And what these people have found is that for constructs like intelligence, working memory, but also second language learning, there's massive studies, Stromswold from the UK with GCSE scores, 50%, more or less 50% of the variability can be explained via the genetic scores. The other 50% are social, okay? So we know, and that would be Plomin's argument, is that it's not nurture versus nature, but there's also actually a nature of nurture, which basically means that if you're a parent, I gather you're a parent, you're a good father, you enjoy reading a lot. So you read a lot with your kid. But you also probably got together with a partner who enjoys reading, because otherwise, it might be, so statistically speaking, that's the case. It's not always the case, but statistically speaking, that's the case. So it is highly likely that you two are actually good readers, and there's a genetic component to it. It's very likely that you're going to transmit this to your offspring, and that you're also creating an environment where there's a lot of reading going on. So it's not just nature versus nurture, it's also the nature of nurture. And that could explain this kind of thing, is that, socially successful people tend to have certain also educational profiles. And I know this is very, very hurtful, especially to people in social sciences to say, and I'm not saying this explains everything, but it could explain to some extent that you have this reproduction, not just of economic and social inequalities, but also of cognitive inequalities. And that would be, like Richard Plomin's point. I can only recommend that book. It's really smart.
I mean, it's not surprising that it predicts learning outcomes, of course. Like, they have better access to learning resources and education, and that's not surprising. But so the cognitive individual differences, that sounds like, it sounds pretty dangerous discussion, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, I know.
I'm gonna stop here. Yeah.
I'm not saying it's all genetic, and that's also not what people like Plomin or Stromswold would say. But there is also a genetic reproduction component, and I think especially if we're interested in social inequalities, it's actually good to be aware of that, because it's something that we can address. Yeah. But I know this is very controversial. I don't know. Do you have any? No.
We'll leave it at that.
Thank you for your presentation. I was very interested in the assumption that in the literature that children not born in Switzerland might not do as well, because there's some really fascinating research that's been done in Canada, and I'd be happy to share you this research done by Callie Mady that actually shows that newcomers to Canada, immigrant children to Canada, really excel in these second language programs, because first of all, they're very motivated to learn French as a second language, and second of all, they often come from multilingual contexts and not monolingual contexts like English Canada.
Yes.
And so there's some really interesting work showing that it's actually children not born in Canada who are excelling in these programs.
Yes, I have to. So we discussed this actually with Canadian colleagues, with Esther Geva, at the very beginning of this project. And you have to keep in mind that the immigration policies of Canada and Switzerland are completely different.
Yeah, the immigrants are often
you
highly
have an
educated.
ocean between the places they come from, and we don't. And so the profile of immigrants in Switzerland is totally different. You cannot compare it. It has got nothing to do with Canadian immigration. Canadian immigration is extremely selective. Swiss immigration is not selective. Even though I'm not glorifying Swiss immigration policy, it's horrible, but it's not selective. It cannot be, because there's no chance. You can't. It's just not possible. And so there's a big difference in the profile of immigrants in Canada and in Switzerland. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm interested in, well, I had a question about the special needs part where you presented the level of support that these children get and how you codified it. Was there any possibility of incorporating parental engagement with the support they get? And I'm saying that because in a pilot study we're currently doing with children who have Down syndrome, bilingual children who have Down syndrome in the United Kingdom, it seems to be the case that engagement and attitudes of the parents toward the institutional support that these kids get will be a predictor of, well, at least in this pilot study or initial study, that's what we seem to be finding. That's why I was wondering whether there were any way of either looking at both things, institutional support versus home language support or engagement with support, or whether incorporating that into the measure would
That's
explain
very
something.
interesting. That's a very interesting thought. We were not able to do that. When we coded this, we basically looked at the system and the way the system is organized, right? So it was very factual, based on questionnaires that we put to the teachers, who told us exactly what child got what measure, but then we didn't go into that. And what we got as information from the parents, those were different sources. We had a questionnaire for the parents where they gave us a lot of information about their home situations, as you have seen. And then we also had part of the child's questionnaire where they were telling us how they perceived parental support. But of course, these are very different sources, but it would be very interesting to merge them, actually. Yes.
Maybe there's time for a quick question.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I just was wondering, because for what you have seen of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, so would you say, I mean, it looks like intrinsic motivation is far more important than extrinsic motivation, because what I think is that whenever they learn, the more they enjoy the learning, and so they learn more. So they get into a virtuous circle that is encouraging. Would you say that the feeling of progress, whenever you are learning anything you are learning, and especially in language, when you feel that you are progressing, nevertheless it's quicker or slower, you get that intrinsic motivation that will help you go further?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what you are mentioning is also the notion of self-efficacy. And I think that plays an important part in how you see your potential as a foreign language learner. Can I do something? Maybe also, have I got the strategies to help myself if I get into a difficult situation? And I think that's one of our messages to teachers, that it's actually, even though teacher encouragement didn't turn out to be so important in relation to the self-concepts, I mean, it's all connected, right? And so the importance of really creating favorable or positive learning environments. I think it just stresses that aspect, how important that is, and to encourage children to become autonomous in their learning. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation.